Lynn Elliott, as I mentioned, is the Director of International Study Programs at the David M. Kennedy Center for International Studies. He returned to this position in 2004. Previously, he had been the International Center's Associate Director and Study Abroad Director at Utah Valley State College from 2001, and prior to that, he had coordinated tours with BYU Performing Arts Management in over 40 countries, including groundbreaking tours to Vietnam, Indonesia, Armenia, and West Africa. His first trip overseas was with the International Folk Dance Ensemble on their trip to Japan, Korea, and the Philippines. Lynn received a BA in economics from BYU and is an MA graduate in international relations of the Kennedy Center. By the time he finished his master's degree here, he had toured over 20 countries and decided to pursue a career in the field of international education. As a PhD candidate, he specialized in East European politics and served as an assistant director for that college's study abroad program in Poland. George Washington University, I believe. University of Virginia. As many of you know, Lynn Elliott around the center, we obviously here at the Kennedy Center are very much interested in the opportunities of study abroad. So we're very pleased to hear from Lynn Elliott today. The title of his lecture, An Experience You Can Afford, the Value of Studying Abroad. Please welcome Lynn Elliott.
Thank you all. Thank you all for being here. This is a little bit risky. We have this audience, and then plus we're recording it for the computer audience, and so I'll try to stay on task as close as I can. But at the risk of being a little informal, you need to know I was thinking about this talk yesterday at the dentist office as I was having one of my teeth ground down for a crown. And I thought, golly, I ought to be able to use this experience as some kind of metaphor for study abroad, that you go through this grinding, painful experience. And once I got that far, I thought, no, this isn't going to work. It's not the message I want to get across. What I want to talk to you, though, about is the value of studying abroad, and not study abroad in the generic sense, doing international internships or field studies, any kind of travel or experience abroad. I want to talk a little bit about that value. I'm not unbiased when it comes to that. My job here at the university, of course, is to promote that. But my joy or my love for travel, for international education, actually goes back a lot further than that. When I was in high school, the first trip that I took out of the country was when I was in high school, and it was with a group of seminary students from Salt Lake City. I'm not from Salt Lake City. We went to Mexico, and I'll tell you, the seminary students from Salt Lake were almost as foreign to me as the Mexicans that we met in Mexico were. But it got me hooked on the thrill of foreign travel. That trip was interesting for me in a lot of ways. Our seminary teacher passed around a flyer in class, said this thing's going to go, you've got to meet up with this group somehow in Salt Lake, but you can go on it. I took the flyer home to my mom thinking it was interesting. At the time, though, I couldn't imagine that I'd be able to go on it because it cost $300. My family was in the kind of financial straits that would have been too much. I showed it to my mom just as interest. And I was surprised when she said, look, I think you ought to go on this. Not only that, I'll pay for you to go on it, and I'll pay for your flight up to Salt Lake City so you can join up with the group. That was the first time that I'd ever flown. It was the first time that I'd left the country. And it was a life-changing event for me. I mean, being in Mexico, especially the part of Mexico we went to, it was a Book of Mormon tour, and you go to see sites that may have some kind of connection with the Book of Mormon. It was an amazing experience. If any of you have been to Mexico City, outside of Mexico City, and seen the Temple of the Sun and the Moon, Teotihuacan, they're pretty amazing things. If you go further south to Oaxaca, the Monte Oblon site, which is just out of Oaxaca, it's a pretty amazing thing. And I came back all fired up about these great places that I had the chance to see. But the most interesting thing to me was I also came back fired up about Mexico and the Mexican people, who I found to be wonderful, beautiful people. And it's a little bit of a confession for me to tell you, where I grew up in northern New Mexico, we had a fairly large Hispanic community in the town that I grew up in. And I had some pretty ingrained biases towards Spanish speakers in general, and Mexicans in particular. And my big fear, I remember when I was in junior high and they would talk in young men's about going on missions, I'd say, well, going on a mission would be okay as long as I don't have to go Spanish speaking, and please, Lord, as long as it's not Mexico. I don't think I could stand that. And I came back off of this trip telling my family, I could go to Mexico. I had such a wonderful trip there. I could go there. I could see being a missionary there. And then my prayers changed to, please, Lord, don't send me to Texas. But that's a different subject that I won't go into today. That trip started my lifelong affair to studying abroad. Now, in my experience, international travel and study has the same effect on all people to a greater or lesser extent. It forces people to come face to face with their own biases and with their own prejudices. Mark Twain said it this way, nothing so liberalizes a man and expands the kindly instincts that nature put in him as travel and the contact with many kinds of people. And I agree with that. I was not the same person that I was before I went to Mexico. When I got back, I was not the same person. It had changed my life. It had fundamentally changed the way that I looked at the world. One of our students who spent last summer, I guess it was a year ago, in Scotland said it this way. Through living in Scotland, everything changed. My best and worst came out in Scotland. It was the first time in my life that I'd really had to face myself, and being thrown out of my own cultural context made me look at myself all the more harshly. I gained a ridiculous respect for the people of all types and culture. And at the same time, while I saw myself so clearly, I learned how to come outside myself. I felt like that I tapped into what my human existence was all about. Now, I'm in the field of international education. We talk all the times about the transforming effect that studying or living abroad can have on people. And one of the big subjects that we talk about is, why is that the case? Why is it that when you leave your surroundings that you're so comfortable with and you go to a foreign surrounding, why does that have such a big impact on your life? And there is a fair amount of scholarly work on that. Not a ton yet, but there is a fair amount of scholarly work that's going on that. But I'd like to explain it this way, and maybe I'll tell you one other personal story to maybe bring this out. When I was a missionary, and I didn't serve in a Spanish-speaking country, by the way, nor did I serve in Texas, but I served in New England, where I realized that even in the United States, you can meet other cultures. When I was a missionary, I was handed a handbook on missionary techniques that could be used in our mission. I don't know if those of you who are returned missionaries got the same thing, but in this handbook, it listed the different kinds of techniques you can use to contact people to get them interested in the church. It listed tracting, street contacting, my least favorite, and I hope they don't do anymore, but phone contacting. But another kind of contacting it listed generically was called change contacting. Now, the way change contacting worked, or at least it was explained to us, is that the missionaries would go to the library or some place where they could have access to the newspapers, and they would look through the obituaries or through the wedding announcements or through the birth announcements, and they would get a list of people that have gone through those life-changing events. And then they would write a note to those people introducing themselves, saying, we're missionaries for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We understand you've gone through this major event in your life. We have a message that we think might be of interest to you at this time of your life. Now, I do have to confess that even though my companion and I did go to the library once and we got a list of names of people to do, we never actually wrote them. In fact, the only thing that we did in the library, and I tell you this at the risk knowing that this is being recorded, but I'll make a clean confession of this now. We went to the library, and after we got this list of names, my companion said, well, let's go see what they have about the Mormons. And we went down to the stacks, and we found the Mormon books. They had a Book of Mormon. I know they had a Book of Mormon. I believe they had a Doctrine and Covenants. They also had a book, which title I can't remember, but it was an anti-Mormon book. And my companion was really quite angry about this. He said, we need to do something about this, Elder. And I said, what can we do? We can't really steal it. We shouldn't deface it. And the books were kept in a bookshelf, a metal bookshelf that had a solid metal base that was about 6 inches high, but it wasn't really solid. It was a hollow metal base. And my companion laid the book on the floor next to the metal base, and then he told me to lift as hard as I could, and both of our strength were able to lift up that shelf. Then he kicked it underneath that, and it's probably still there. I won't confess to you what city that was, but and I have to confess I haven't felt really guilty about that since. But in this talk, I want to talk a little bit more about this idea of change. Even though I didn't use the change contacting method myself as a missionary, what I did notice as a missionary, and then since then, as I've met many other people that have joined the church, is most people, I think it's safe to say most people join the church not out of the blue, but they become interested in the church when there's a significant change in their lives. and they're questioning. And in the Mormon terminology, they're humble and they're teachable. Or as Alma put it, and this is from Alma 12:10, and therefore he that will harden his heart, the same receiveth a lesser portion of the word. He that will not harden his heart, to him is given the greater portion of the word, until it is given unto him to know the mysteries of God, until he know them in the full. I think that is what international travel does to people. They don't realize that it's softening them. But just the mere fact that you're traveling international forces you to soften your stance, to get rid of biases, to become a better person, or at least a more teachable person. And this is a concept, like I mentioned, that all Latter-day Saints should be familiar with. We talk all the time about being humble and being teachable. A student who recently returned from Romania put it this way. These quotes, by the way, I'm getting from real students who've gone on BYU programs. They write these in their end of the program evaluations. While in Romania, I learned to laugh at the hardest of circumstances. Working with my Romanian orphans made me realize just how close heaven is. It made me realize there is always something to smile about. I learned that the Savior is always there for us. I learned that the most forgotten people in life are some of the most special. And I also learned that the Beatles were right. All you need is love. Okay. What stresses does one face when they travel internationally that forces them to be humble, to become more humble? I want to talk about a few of those. The first and the most obvious stress that someone faces when they travel is the language. I don't know anything more humbling than to go into a restaurant and realize that you don't have enough language capability to order food. To me, that is a very humbling experience. And I want to share an interesting fact that I came across this summer. I know a few people who, like me, travel a fair amount and travel to lots of different places. So there's lots of different countries you're in with lots of different languages. I was talking to one of my friends who does the same thing, and he confessed to me, he said, when I travel abroad, I eat at McDonald's a lot. I don't eat at McDonald's at home that much. I eat at McDonald's a lot when I travel abroad. And I said, I do the same. I hardly ever eat at McDonald's. And we got talking, and we realized the reason was because an American can go and order at McDonald's without being humiliated, pretty much anywhere in the world, because the McDonald's lingo is all the same. I mean, a Big Mac is kind of standard lingua franca for the entire world. It's humiliating to me to go in to order food. Other things, language-wise, getting on a bus and asking how much the fare is or asking where the bus is going. All of these kind of day-to-day things that we just do naturally in our own comfortable environment, you can't do when you have to deal with a foreign language. You need to know that that doesn't just apply to non-English speaking countries. In my experience, you can have just as much problem with language going to English-speaking countries as you can to non-English-speaking countries. I tell people that travel to the UK, it's a great place for Americans to go because even though you can't understand what people are saying, at least you can read all the signs. But even that is not true. For those of you who've been to the UK will know, it's hard to explain when you go into a supermarket and you see a big sign that says BAPS on clearance today or BAPS on sale today, and know what people are talking about. Or you see a sign that talks about a cash point. There's all these kind of signage that you see in the UK that are hard to understand. The thing I find most amusing, though, is our students that go on our London program, our London Center programs, well, all of our programs based in London, we assign them to local branches or wards to serve in. And it's not uncommon for me to hear a student say something like this. Brother Dr. Elliott, I just went to my ward today, and the Elders Quorum president got up and gave a talk, and he swore in the church, and no one was shocked by it. And the reason for that, of course, is some of the words that are profane in English, American English, are not profane in UK English. And it's kind of an amusing shock to hear students come face to face with that. You need to know it works both ways. One of the things that I find most entertaining is there's some British slang that actually is very, very profane. And I will hear Americans, good BYU students, imitating the Brits, using this British slang that I happen to know is very, very profane. It's the same problem. And I often think it's got to be amusing to the British Saints to find BYU students show up to their wards swearing like sailors. And at the same time, the American students think the same about the Brits. Interesting thing. Language is just one fact, though, that people face when they go abroad. Another fact is the more generic idea of culture and of which language is a part. But when you leave your surroundings here, whenever you go to a new community, you're going to face a new culture. I thought this was interesting. This was a quote, again, from a student that went on one of our programs, but was an international student. I don't know where the student was from, but they said this: I personally had some culture shock when I came to the United States, and I'm not sure it will be all the same, or I'm sure it will be all the same with other students going outside the U.S. for study abroad. I had such a hard time understanding what's considered to be appropriate manners and what's not when I came to America. Now, you have to think this international student probably knew a lot about America, probably had seen lots of American movies, knew about American food, but still they come to America and they realize all of a sudden that they're facing a new culture. Now, my favorite definition when we talk about this for culture is this: a culture is the unwritten rules, the unwritten but understood rules that govern a community's life. And every community has those unwritten but understood rules. For those of you who, like me, came to Utah as a non-Utahn, came to BYU, I can tell you that Utah Mormonism has a culture all of its own, which I am now become acclimated to. But when my family comes to visit me and they ask me about my neighbors, I talk about the neighbors to the right and to the left, and they say, well, what about the neighbors across the street? And I say, well, you know, they're in another state. We don't really associate with them. It's just a thing of Utah life. We understand that. Of course, they're another sect. They have a different bishop. You know, they're friendly. We see them occasionally, but we're not involved with them in a day-to-day life. And I suspect that all of you, when you first came to BYU and started getting involved in the social scene, you suddenly realized that BYU has its own cultural norms that govern the social life here at BYU. We see these kind of cultural changes all the places we go to. When you go to a foreign country, a new language, and hugely different new cultural expectations, it can be hard. Now, I had one student, another comment from a student on this line that I wanted to read to you. I became more aware of Korea and its way of thinking and how a nation that is not so friendly to Americans think. Interesting. Most Americans think Koreans love Americans. When I've been to Korea, they've always treated me nicely. But this student had a different experience. After he'd been in Korea a while, he realized that Koreans don't universally have a love affair with America. He goes on to say, having the experience I did with the people and situations in Korea led me to think it's important to understand another culture when dealing with them, and intercultural interactions need mutual understanding. And that is true, and that's one of the things that come out when you face culture shock, is you get into a new culture and you realize that they don't see the world the same way that you do. Now, I do need to put one side note here. In my experience, Americans are pretty ignorant about what happens outside America. And it's one of the things that I find most exciting about taking students or seeing students go abroad is they learn this new world, they learn about the world. But I need to tell you, I've traveled enough to say that Americans aren't the only ones that are ignorant of what happens outside their own country. In my experience, that's a common trait shared by just about everyone throughout the world, unless they travel. And this student went on to say, I think there is a lack among many Koreans of the understanding the outside world, which leads to misunderstandings. And he goes on to add, unfortunately, in the United States, there is also this problem. Okay, apart from the kind of mental discomfort that comes from living in a community and dealing with a new culture, there's also true physical discomfort. When you travel abroad, you're going to face jet lag, sleep deprivation, you could face sickness. All of these kind of things. I mean, you're going to see new animals, new plants, new foods, new climate. I need to tell you, one of the most dislocating things to me is traveling to a country that's near the equator. And I don't know if any of you have been to a country near the equator. But when I first went to West Africa, I thought, this is odd. The sun rises at 6 and it sets at 6 p.m., rises at 6 a.m., sets at 6 p.m., and twilight feels like it's about 30 seconds. I mean, it starts to get dark, and the next thing you know, it's pitch black. And to me, I found that amazingly disconcerting, that all of a sudden there's no kind of lingering twilight that you can look at the sun. Other people find other minor things like that to be very disconcerting. And collectively, we refer to all of that shock that you're facing to culture shock, the phenomenon of culture shock. Now, there's been quite a bit of scholarly work done on culture shock. There's been lots of theories to explain culture shock. Two very prominent theories dealing with culture shock are what are called the U curve and the W curve. The U curve explanation of culture shock is that a student enters a culture at this point, and they're all excited to be there, but as they're there for a while, they realize it's harder and harder, and they get worn down by the changes till they hit a bottom here at the U. And then after they hit bottom, then they start coming back up at it. And after they're in the culture for a while, then they're back as high as they were when they first got there. Other people looked at that and said, that's really too simplistic to think that it's all or nothing. You go down and come back up. Culture shock is really like a W curve. You start at one point, you go down, you come up, you go down, you come up, until you end at some point in the distance when hopefully you're up. But dealing with culture is a constant give and take. All of these theories, though, share the same thing in common: how to deal with culture shock. You need to be patient, and you need to be open-minded, and those people who are patient and open-minded usually will be able to acclimate to the culture fairly quickly. In Mormon terms, though, I would put it this way, referring back to the scripture I said, these are people who have not hardened their heart, who have become teachable and humble. If you're teachable and humble, willing to be patient and long-suffering, then you can acclimate to the culture. Okay. Talked a little bit about culture shock, a little bit about the stresses you face when you travel. Having said all this, what kind of things are you likely to learn in a general sense? What kind of things are you likely to learn when you travel abroad? And I want to talk just a little bit about 3 general areas that you can learn things abroad more effectively, in my opinion, than you can learn them here in the United States or staying in the United States. International study programs here at BYU, we have 3 learning outcomes that are within our mission statement. And they are intercultural skills. All students who go on our program should learn intercultural skills, should learn the importance of being global citizens, and should learn specific discipline knowledge within an international setting. Now, I want to talk a little briefly about all 3 of those. First, the intercultural skills. What we mean by intercultural skills is learning to empathize with a new culture. Not necessarily agree with a new culture, but learning to empathize with a new culture. And also learning to be able to navigate or to adapt to a new culture. Those are skills that can be learned, and we see for most of our students they do learn those when they study abroad, when they spend time abroad. Part of the reason for that, of course, is they don't really have an option. They're under this stress again, and they have to learn those things. But we think that those are very powerful, useful skills. Let me share just a couple other comments from students. This, again, was from an international student, and they said, "Just the fact that I'm here in the United States makes me learn more about Americans and Mormon culture. I think study abroad and international travel is a very important part of my educational formation. I believe it gives me more security, and I feel very cosmopolitan and able to progress in any part of the world. I'm not intimidated now to go somewhere else and learn other cultures." That's the idea of intercultural learning, where you're able to adapt to a new culture. Or this from a student that went to Vienna. "I've studied abroad before. It was a different culture than the Viennese culture. But the concepts are the same as to what is needed to do to assimilate oneself. That is not to say that the culture was the same, but the attitude and open-mindedness that one needs are the same. I think the most important thing is that people need to learn that the way other people do things is not wrong, it's just different. And we should embrace the differences as what makes us unique and special. When you go abroad, if you do it right with an open mind, you will learn those intercultural skills. Now, the second learning objective that we have is learning the importance of good global citizenship. In a recent survey of students I read just this last week who studied abroad for a short period of time, from 3 to 4 weeks, they were asked what their interest in international events were before they went on the program as compared with after they went on the program. 46% said that before they went on the program, they were very or extremely interested in international events. After they went on the program, that jumped to 71%. Likewise, they were also asked how interested they were in foreign cultures. And again, before the students went, they said 74% of them said they were interested in foreign cultures. That jumped up to 93% after having done the travel. I've seen this personally in numerous cases. Students who have kind of a maybe passing interest in what happens in global affairs. They go abroad, and all of a sudden that changes their interest in what happens outside the United States. And it's an important skill, and as I say, we list that as one of our learning objectives, is to get people to think about what it means to be a global citizen and to develop the analytical skills necessary to understand what happens in the world. This is becoming a more and more important skill every day. The world is becoming more and more interconnected, so much so that what happens in Iraq or in Georgia can have an impact on you living here in Provo, Utah. And if you look at it in a church sense, the church is no longer primarily in the United States. It's an international church with a majority of the members outside. The ability to understand global issues is going to become more and more important in the church context as well, I believe. All right. The third specific kind of learning, or the third learning objective we have, is specific discipline knowledge in an international setting. Once you're overseas learning something hands-on, it becomes much more powerful to you, no matter what you're learning. And I've seen this happen in all kinds of subjects. The reason for that, again, I would tie back to this idea of stress. You're learning this under stress, stress in a good way. Everything is new. You have to get rid of preconceived notions. As one BYU student who went to Uganda put it, hands-on experience, in my opinion, is always better and more informative and life-altering than classroom experience. Practical experience is something that requires knowledge, application, and true understanding. Whereas classroom education simply requires the ability to memorize and regurgitate information for tests. Hands-on experience teaches things that you can really use. And I love hands-on experiences. Now, I don't want to downgrade what happens in the classroom, because lots of good learning does. What I do want to point out is, in my experience, studying abroad and learning in a foreign setting often is more effective than learning in a classroom. Now, that is most obvious, or most of the scholarly work on that has been done in language acquisition. For those of you who have served foreign missions, you know that once you get abroad, it's a different thing to learn a language. And there is scholarly work that pretty much demonstrates that if you truly want to learn a language, the best thing you can do is move to some place where that language is spoken and be immersed completely in the language. But in my experience, the same kind of effect happens whether you're studying art, literature, political science, history. If you're learning that on site, where that literature, that art was created, it's a much more powerful learning experience. And again, I've seen that happen in many occasions. Okay. Hopefully I've given you some reason to think that it's important or worthwhile to study abroad, and some reasons why that might happen, or at least some logical or intellectual reasons why that kind of learning might happen. I want to spend a little bit of time answering another question. Why should you study abroad? What is in it for you to study abroad? I'd point out first that in our culture, in the Mormon culture, there is a value put on intelligence or learning for its own sake. So when I talk about going abroad and learning new cultures and those kind of things, we believe as Latter-day Saints that the only thing that carries on with us after we die is our intelligence. So any learning that we gain is going to be valuable. If you doubt that, I should also point out that we're commanded, not patted on the back and suggested, but we actually are commanded to learn about foreign things. This is from Doctrine and Covenants, section 88, verses 78 and 79, and I'll read just part of it, but it says, "We are commanded to learn of things both in heaven and in earth and under the earth, things which have been, things which are, things which must shortly come to pass, things which are at home and things which are abroad, the wars and the perplexities of nations and the judgments which are upon the land, and a knowledge also of countries and kingdoms." In my opinion, and again, this is not an unbiased opinion, but in my opinion, the most effective way to do that is to travel and to study abroad. The best way to learn about countries and kingdoms and the perplexities of nations is to spend time in those countries and kingdoms. Okay, if those reasons are too esoteric for you, though, let me give you some more hard, fast reasons why I think you ought to study abroad. First of all, there is a fair amount of evidence, some of it anecdotal, but also some of it done through formal research, that studying abroad can actually improve your options or your ability to get into graduate schools, the graduate programs. When a graduate committee looks at who they're going to accept into their program, they tend to look for a number of things, one of which is they want to find students who are going to succeed in their program. And if you can show through having traveled abroad that you're able to adapt to a new culture, that will rank highly, or that will help in that application process. The other thing that one of the other things that graduate committee people look for is diversity. Students who will bring a kind of diverse experience to their graduate cohorts. If you've studied abroad and you've spent time abroad, it will help in that regard. In my own case, as Corey mentioned, I did a fair amount of traveling when I was a student at BYU. And even though my GPA and my test scores were okay, I mean, they were pretty good, when it came time to apply for graduate programs, I'm convinced that the fact that I had traveled so much when I was a student actually helped me get into my graduate program. And it actually gave me options when it came time to pick graduate programs. Now, of course, I majored in international relations, so you would think that's kind of obvious. Maybe the international travel would help. But I've seen the same kind of effect happen for students who apply to medical school, dental school, business school, law school, and who apply to the arts, humanities, and social sciences. When it comes time to apply for a graduate program, all other things being equal, the fact that you spent time international can have a positive effect on your application. And again, there is a fair amount of research and anecdotal evidence that suggests that that's the case. The second reason that you ought to consider studying abroad, or the valuable reason to study abroad, is because it can give you life skills that can translate into money in the sense of wages or higher wages and job opportunities. Now, when you study abroad, we've talked a little bit about the skills you're likely to learn, the intercultural skills you're likely to learn. The ability to deal with new situations, new environments, and new people, all of which skills you learn when you study abroad, are valuable in almost any vocation. I mean, I guess if you're going to be a web designer who never sees people, then maybe you'll be okay. But in just about every vocation that you go into, those skills are going to translate into being valuable vocational skills. And as a result, you're likely to get the monetary benefits that come from having acquired those skills. This is one more quote, the last quote that I have from a student, but student who went to London. After having studied abroad, I have a much broader sense of what it is in this world. Perhaps the most important change was my confidence in handling situations where I'm not particularly comfortable and in dealing with people. Because I was forced to deal with new situations almost daily, I became much more confident in my ability to do so. Now, as a person who hires a fair number of people on a regular basis, I will tell you, now, of course, it's a little biased because, of course, I work in international relations, but I will tell you the fact that international study abroad, or travel appears on a transcript or a resume has a lot of appeal to me. I can see value in that. Let me mention just a little more evidence on that. Performing arts management, Corey mentioned that I worked there for several years. Here on campus, Performing Arts Management does a survey of the students who go on the performing tours. One of the questions they ask in that survey is, does your tour experience help you develop employment-related skills? On the most recent survey I saw of it, that came out just this summer, the vast majority, 84% of the students who went on those tours, and these tours are about 3 to 4 weeks, said that they felt like the experiences that they gained overseas helped them develop job-related skills. Now you can look at that and say, okay, that's students just like you who are going to go on this experience, and of course you're going to say it's going to create skills. But a more interesting fact to me is that same survey was given about 10 years ago. And it was given not just to the students who went on tour that year, but we also gave it to the alumni who were 5 to 10 years out from having toured. These are people who are then in the job market, actually having jobs, real jobs, and doing those kind of things. And the results were about the same. The vast majority of them said that the skills they learned traveling overseas translated into vocational or career skills that help them in their own life. Okay, let me give you a third reason to consider studying abroad. If any of you are interested in working abroad someday and having a career that's going to take you abroad on an overseas assignment, the best advice I can give you is to study abroad when you're a student. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence that suggests that that's the case. In my field, again, it's kind of a skewed field because it is international education, but the vast majority of the people who do what I do at other universities across the United States studied abroad when they were students. There is a recent survey, though, and that's talking in the international education field, but there is evidence starting to come out, research that's starting to come out that suggests that that's true not just in international education. The most recent study that I saw actually came out. It was a study done in Norway about Norwegian students who left Norway to study abroad for part of the time they're in college. And that study found that students who leave and study abroad from Norway are more likely to find jobs internationally once they graduate. I suspect that if you were to survey American expatriates who are working abroad, a big chunk of them, if not a majority of them, would have studied abroad as a student. And it makes sense. I mean, logically, conceptually, that makes sense to me. If I was the owner of a business and I had an international opportunity and I had two candidates, one of which had studied abroad and one of which hadn't, which of those two am I more likely to pick for this international experience? To me, that makes sense. Okay, I've given you some of the practical reasons for study abroad, some of the intellectual reasons for study abroad. The last couple of minutes, I just want to spend a little bit about some of the more logistical nuts and bolts reasons. Studying abroad can be expensive. Our most expensive program, the most expensive program that BYU offers, is the program that we do at the London Center for a semester. Currently, the program fees for that is $8,400 for the semester, to which you need to add an airfare and whatever spending money. So really, it's going to cost you $10,000 to $11,000 to study there, which is a lot of money. I'm not going to downplay that it's not a lot of money. But you have to take a couple of things into mind. First of all, BYU programs are about 40 to 50% cheaper than comparable programs abroad. I checked on this yesterday. I knew that this was still the case, but the most comparable program to what we offer at BYU is a program offered by FIE, Foundation for International Education in London. Their current rates are between $15,000 and $18,000 for a semester, and the prices go up from there. BU, Boston University, which has the most expensive program I know in London, starts for a semester at $22,000. So we like to pat ourselves on the back. It still is a lot of money. I'm not going to downplay that. But it's not the only program we offer at BYU. BYU, last I checked this just yesterday, we currently have 12 programs that are cheaper than they are to live here on BYU campus. And that's based on the university standard of $5,100. The university estimates it costs $5,100 to live here for a semester. We have 12 programs that are at that price or less. We have many programs that are not that much more than that price. The other thing I point out to students, though, is you're looking at the price without considering all of the benefits or all of the other financial things that you can tap into. Any federal BYU financial aid or BYU financial aid can be used towards a BYU study abroad program. That's Pell Grants, Stafford loans, and the great thing about Pell Grants and Stafford loans is they don't base that on the $5,100 it costs to live in Provo. If you apply and get in the process earlier, that financial aid is based on the $10,000 that it costs to live in London. So you actually will qualify for a higher level of financial aid if you go on a study abroad program. Our financial aid office here is very, very helpful on that. They're very, very keen on making these programs affordable and available for students. I will just mention a couple of things as I end. Last year, BYU, we had 158 programs in 59 different countries. If you look at your career plans, and I'm hoping all of you, and I can say this at BYU, but I hope all of you prayerfully look at what your career plans are and what your major is and what it is that you need to be studying here. If you do that, and it looks like you need to include an international element in that, I would strongly encourage you to come and talk to someone here in the center about studying abroad. You can afford it. It is possible to do. Like most things, though, that are valuable, it'll probably take some sacrifice, may take some short-term sacrifice, and maybe even long-term sacrifice in the form of loans. But it can be worth it. And I like to tell this to students, if you're serious about learning about international things, it's something that you need to do. Just like if you're a doctor, if you're serious about being a doctor, you've got to go to medical school, or a dentist goes to dental school. If you're serious about international things, you need to get out and travel and see the world, because there's no better way that you're going to learn about it. Now, we have just a few minutes. I'll end with that, but I will take some questions, right? We okay on the question thing? We have it for about 5 minutes if there are questions. And if not, I'm not going to be offended. We'll just end early. But does anyone have anything to ask, to plug? Yes, sir. Wait for the mic, though. Well, we want to get your voice on record, too.
Tell us your name and your major.
My name is Drew Meekum, and I'm majoring in history. And I'm wondering what criteria BYU uses in deciding which study abroad programs to keep or to get rid of or to maybe start up new. For example, I went on a Cambridge study abroad. Mm-hmm. I know that is under review. A lot of people feel like it's not worth the cost. So what criteria goes into that choice?
Well, first of all, did you feel it was worth the cost to be in Cambridge for the semester?
Absolutely.
Okay. As long as we have a cohort of students who feel that way, we're going to keep that program. At least for us, speaking specifically of that program, we see a lot of benefits from it. It's one of the programs we offer in the UK, but it gives a different experience than a London Center program. we feel very strongly about it. It also is one of our more expensive programs, but do you regret having spent all that money? Oh, great. I didn't plant him either. He's there perfectly. What we look at on a program is we look first at the student safety. If there's any kind of safety issue, then we would cancel a program or we wouldn't do a program. We'd also second look at student interest, and then there needs to be some faculty interest because these do need to be academic programs. If we don't have good faculty support or faculty interest, then a program might be in danger. To the best of my knowledge, though, the Cambridge program meets all of those criteria fine. So, yes, sir.
My name is Darren Jackson. I'm majoring in international relations. My question is, I completely agree with the value of international education. I found, though, that in the United States, in our political environment, we're fairly reticent to incorporate policies from other countries or international examples as possible options for our own country. Now, the first major change I've seen in that is with the new consideration of healthcare. We start to look at French and German systems. Do you think as the number of students going abroad increases, we'll start to see a change in our political environment where we start to look more seriously at what our other countries are doing? Is that possible in our own nation?
Yeah, the reason that we don't look seriously is because we don't know a whole lot about what happens in other countries. And as we have more students go abroad, I think it's going to happen. Now, you need to know the American, this is a government goal. The Department of Education goal is to get 1 million American students studying abroad each year. Currently, we have about 170,000 students studying abroad each year, so that's a 7-fold increase, maybe an 8-fold increase in the number. And in our field, in international education, we don't know how we would do that yet. But if we got to the point that we had 1 million students studying abroad every year, yeah, I think we would more seriously consider things that happen abroad. I don't know, though, and by the way, and this is a little controversial when we talk about it in our circles, but I'm not convinced it's going to make all that much difference in the way politics happen. Just because you know another policy better doesn't mean you're going to like it anymore. In fact, it's possible you're going to like it much, much less. I can tell you, frankly, I hope that whatever the dental plan they use in the UK, we never adopt here in the United States. That's just one example. But yeah, I think people would more seriously. They would be less reticent, less knee-jerk in opposition against foreign ideas. I thought it was interesting, if you saw the survey, BBC just introduced it, if Barack Obama was running for president of the world, he would win. And now the Barack campaign, the Obama campaign, is trying to downplay that as much as they possible because that's actually a deficit here in the United States. And so maybe it wouldn't be, we had 1 million students studying each year, maybe that wouldn't be such a big issue. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you all for attending. I appreciate your attendance. Thanks.